Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening. And before we get into today's episode, I just want to give you guys a heads up because the wonderful people at Fort Worth Public Library reached out to me recently to let me know that throughout 2022, they are doing a number of different gardening series. And these are, things that are going on both, online through Zoom, but also, at the library itself. They currently have one series going on about native and invasive Texas plants, which I will link up to in the description of the podcast. But they have another one that's coming up. So in partnership with the Fort Worth Water Department, Rooted In, and the Tarrant Regional Water District, the Fort Worth Public Library will be presenting a series of programs throughout 2022 focusing on gardening, water conservation, native plants, and how to make your landscape work for you and the environment. And of course, if you guys didn't already know, I'm a very big advocate of using resources that you have nearby, and that includes the local library. There's lots of different programs that libraries across the country here in the US offer, so go and check them out and see what they've got going on. But this upcoming gardening series that they've got going on is a free 8-part series focusing on, gardening, water conservation, native plants, and really how to kind of make what you have work within your environment. So they've got things online via Zoom, also in person at various libraries. So starting kind of March 12th, they've got Your Better Yard Part 1, and then March 19th is Your Better Yard Part 2. April 9 is Sprinkler Spruce Up, and April 16th is also a Sprinkler Spruce Up. By May 14 is Lawn Care, Green with Envy, and June 11th is Dang It's Hot, Cool Off with Shade Gardening. That sounds like a really neat one to get in on. And October 8 is Flitter Flutter Flowers Butterfly Gardening. And November 12th is Trees for North Texas. And I'm going to put the link for that series that is going to be coming up also in the description of today's episode. So if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, then definitely check those out. But also don't hesitate to check out your local library anyway, because there's loads of really cool programs and things that libraries do. And the more that we visit them and let them know, hey, these things would be kind of interesting for us, then they're able to kind of support the community a little bit better as well. I know from talking to some of you listeners who are involved with the local libraries, that a lot of libraries also do kind of a seed library or a seed exchange program. So head on over to your local library and see what they've got going on. All right, so let's get on with today's episode because I found this wonderful quote a couple of months back by Arthur Ashe. I use it more I was using it to motivate me for exercising, because every little helps when it comes to doing that. But I think the quote actually works incredibly well for somebody who wants to start gardening or homesteading. So let me read you the quote. It is, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Right? Isn't that wonderful? And I think it fits very nicely with my husband's grandfather's saying of use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. I think the two of those together go really well hand in hand as part of, a homesteader's mantra. And I think it's a great reminder that you really don't need to have all the things, when you're starting out to homestead or starting a garden, right? Start small and build on what you have and your successes. So let's break down a garden that you could start where you are, use what you already have, and do what you can. Okay, so let's start where you are. And the first thing for a garden is finding a spot in your yard that gets the most light. Plants need lots of light to grow well, and fruit and vegetables are going to grow best in a position where you get more than 8 hours of light in the growing season. And the goal of this isn't to get overly complicated or anything. It's just to get you started. So if this is your first garden, find where you get the most light in your yard and focus on that. Sure, if you were, living in the South, like if you're in Texas or, I know, there's a lot of listeners out there in Georgia and Alabama and also in Florida, where you guys are dealing with humidity as well as the sun, that can create its own set of challenges. And yes, there are some nuances to gardening in those areas. However, of course, if you're in Texas, then the Fort Worth Public Library has got something that might be interesting with the June 11th, Dang It's Hot Cool Off with Shade Gardening. I'm really interested in that one. But, there's differences to, the climate that you're in, right? Those of you listening in from beautiful California, right, you guys are having to deal with the sun and the heat, just like those of you that are in Arizona and New Mexico, right, and Nevada. There's differences wherever you are, but, in terms of if this is your first garden, the best advice is you want to find where you get the most light in the garden and then, in your yard, right? Because that's going to be the best place for your veggies to grow, right? Vegetables, they do so much better when they get the most amount of light. And if this is your first garden, right, we want to help set you up for success. So, find the spot that is, the most sunny, and it might only be a teeny weeny spot, and that's okay. You could put a plant in there, and that's the first thing that you start with. You don't necessarily need to be, digging up your entire lawn for a garden. You can if you want, and if your, HOA and stuff allows it. I'm definitely an advocate of food over lawns. But if this is your first garden, it's easy to try and do all the things, and it's much better for you to scale it back and start small, with a small little garden and, work on improving those. So let's say that you've found the bit in your yard that gets the most light. You're like, okay, great. Got it, Emma. Right, now what? So let's talk about use what you have. So we're going to use whatever you have available to start your garden. If you have a load of cardboard because somebody just made you relocate across the country again, you go ahead and use that, right? Granted, I understand that everybody has moved house and has a ton of cardboard in every single room in their house. So, if you have these things, then feel free to use them, right? If you've got a bunch of cardboard, you could totally use that and start putting it towards making a no-dig garden, right? You can use that cardboard to smother out the grass and the weeds. But if you don't have a house full of cardboard that feels like that you're living in a box fort, don't sweat it. You don't need it for a garden. You could go ahead and have a dig garden instead. And, I am pretty determined this year to video starting a garden so I can show you step by step how I'm doing things here. Because, gardening's a learning curve, and even though I've lived in different places and I've had a garden, right, just as I was saying earlier, there's different nuances to where you live, right? And I'm in a different climate again than what I was before, but I'm also gardening on a north slope, and I've never gardened on a north slope before, so that's kind of exciting. But as soon as the snow melts, which I'm hopeful is going to be soon-ish, now that the days are getting longer, I'm always hopeful that spring is on the way. It is going to be quite interesting because I've got new soil, I've got a new landscape to kind of tackle. There's the slope, issue that we now have. So it's going to actually be really fun in learning how to make this garden thrive and really working with what I have and using things that are already here on the property to be able to make the garden grow. Like, sure, I could, order in a bunch of compost and have that delivered and create my garden beds. Sure, I could do that. But I would probably rather put the money that was going to be used for that in redoing the flooring or some of the other projects that we need to get done a little more urgently around the house. So I digress. Let's get back to use what you have. You might be thinking, what's a dig garden, Emma? Well, my friend, a dig garden is one where you are going to dig or to till. So you would want to be grabbing a gardening fork and a shovel, maybe a helper or two. And what you do is you basically push that gardening fork or shovel into the ground with your foot. You pull back on the handle and lift that soil out. Turf, weed, soil, the lot. Right? Some gardeners just put that first turfy layer to one side, then they put the garden fork back into the ground and lift out a forkful or a shovelful of soil again. You turn that second shovel or forkful upside down, put it back into that space and just kind of break up that soil a little bit, and then put that turfy bit of soil that you took out originally and put it on top with that grassy turfy stuff facing down. So that's touching the soil, right? This is so that the grass and the weeds will break down and decompose and feed the soil. Other gardeners do the same thing, but they take out the grass and the weeds. So rather than just putting it the grassy, turfy side, straight down, they actually break that piece up and remove all the weeds, carefully pulling out the roots and everything else. You can put those weeds and grass and stuff, like put them to steep in a bucket of water for a couple of weeks to kill off those tenacious weeds before putting them into the compost heap. If you have compost or other soil amendments available to you, maybe you've got some well-rotted chicken manure, or you were lucky to find a stable that feeds their horses organic feed so there's no residue pesticides, and they're like, hey, please come take our manure because we have too much of it. That happened quite a lot in the UK where, stables were literally giving away manure. Like they would have like the old horse feed bags like on the side of the road filled with manure, and you could just grab whatever you wanted. That was pretty cool. But if that's available to you and you want to put that on your garden, then as you're turning the soil over, that is a really good time to either add that in and dig it over a little bit, or just kind of cover it on top. I mean, you can dig it through to help distribute it within that soil, but you don't have to. You can just layer it on top and let things naturally work and break down, right? Worms are really good at bringing things into the soil. But if you don't have them available, then don't sweat it. You don't have to use them for your first garden. Same with green manures or cover crops, right? If you have them and you want to use them, great. If you don't, then don't worry about it. Don't think that you need to be buying all of these things to get your garden going. And, I know this is somebody that would look at my seed collection possibly on Facebook. I think I put a picture of my dog next to like 2 or 3 totes full of seeds that I'd saved or seeds that I'd purchased, right? Somebody looking at that might be like, oh my God, I need to have all of the things. But you don't need to have all of the things, right? Those seeds and things, they took years for me to collect and to save and to kind of build up a collection, right? And it's same with anything with gardening, right? It's taken me time to, have the things and be able to use them. And when it comes down to it, like the very basic tools that I use day in and day out when it comes to the garden are my garden fork. The shovel honestly gets used way more for shoveling snow and maybe putting grit down than it ever does in the garden, because I use the garden fork all the time. And I'll use a trowel to, plant things by hand, and that's about it. Maybe some secateurs or hand pruners. Everything else is kind of done with my hands. But I understand that not everybody's like that, right? Other people want to use more tools and stuff, so that's totally fine, right? Use what you have. I will say, though, that today I bought a vintage scythe and I am incredibly excited to use that. Although I was wandering around the Habitat for Humanity store with it on my shoulder and they were like, can you put this behind the register, please, so you don't accidentally take anybody out with this? So I was like, oh yeah, sure, I didn't even think of that. But that's kind of the latest tool that I've bought, and that's really to tackle a rather unruly patch of raspberry canes that we have. It's there because there's no way that I'm going to be able to get the mower through it, and it is such a large area. There's no way I'm going to be able to hand prune that all. But that's like the latest tool that I ever got. But really, you don't need to have all of these things, right? If you're starting small and you're going to do a dig garden, right? Invest in some, basic tools if you can, or borrow them from somebody. And, maybe a friend's got some gardening equipment and they're, willing to come and help you, break the ground in your new garden, right? What a great way to spend time with people, right? Maybe not when it comes to digging. That might be a bit of a hard sell, but you never know. And one of the wonderful things about gardening is, I always say this, but there is many ways to garden as there are gardeners and people on the planet, and you can really do what works for you. So use what you have. Don't worry about running out and buying all the things. Homesteaders typically use what they have, like what they already have around, right? Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without, right? So that use what you have, okay? You might be curious, how do I dig a garden? Since I said earlier that I was going to be looking at videoing how I'm starting a garden. And I'm going to be doing two, actually. I'm going to be doing a dig and a no-dig garden. And that's kind of how I roll, like, because I want a garden putting in relatively quickly and I don't want to be having to pay to have like large inputs of compost and stuff in it. A dig garden makes more sense. I do have compost started on the garden or in the garden, but nowhere near enough that I would need to be able to prep all these beds to be like a, lasagna garden or a no-dig garden. And, these things are going to take time to do. So I'm opting for a dig garden. And I'm going to be honest, I actually quite like digging a garden and pulling the weeds out. But having now a much bigger space to put garden beds in, I'm starting to think that turf down method is going to be a good idea for speed. However, when you do that and you just put that turf side down, you are going to need to do some weeding, right? You are going to get like grass sprouting up and around, where the light isn't blocked out. It's just going to be a lot less than what it was as if you were trying to, plant straight into the grass. So, the advantage is you're going to have fewer weeds, but you're still going to need to do some weeding. So there's, a payoff there that you've got to weigh out. So I might do some where I was just pulling out the weeds and then others where I'm going to do turf down. I can totally see after I've been, digging and pulling weeds out for a few hours where I would start to be thinking, all right, I'm just going to put some turf down and I'll worry about that later on when I've got a bit more energy. So, we'll see how it pans out on the day. And, that's part of it too, right? How do you feel as a gardener as you're doing some of these things? But that kind of leads me rather nicely onto our final point, which is do what you can. Because growing your own food isn't a race. And it has taken me a lot of trial and error to grow vegetables and fruit and herbs. And even now, it's not always a sure thing. right? And, you know, I've moved to a different climate that I've got to try and figure out, a different soil type, right? You know, this is all gonna be an interesting learning experiment for me this year, right? That's all, like, whatever your first garden is really a fun and delicious, hopefully, experiment. But the best advice I can give to somebody or anyone who is wanting to grow their own food is just to do it, right? To try a small garden bed, a couple of veggies that you really like to eat, right? There's nothing wrong with starting small and keeping things manageable. It's actually quite daunting to be going from, you know, a side yard like what we had in Utah to growing on like half an acre. It's actually quite scary for me. And, you know, I'll be honest, it was kind of scary when I got my first allotment. Like, that bad boy was like thigh high in weeds. And, you know, I think that's part of the thing. Like, for those of you that are listening in the UK, right, if you're new to getting an allotment, like, they always seem to give you the ones that are like a thicket of brambles or, you know, so high with, you know, the grass and the weeds, you're kind of wondering if you're going to find, you know, a lost civilization in there. And I think part of it is to kind of test you out as a gardener. Like, are you able to kind of tackle this and manage it? But I got to tell you, like, when you get through something, you know, as kind of yikes and overgrown as those things are, and you see the rewards and where you've come from, oh my gosh, it makes, you know, it kind of, you know, sets you right there on like, oh my gosh, I really achieved so much. And you're able to kind of like take a step back and be like, wow, this is so much different from what it was before. But you do what you can when you can. And that's the only way that I've found to be able to tackle some of these bigger projects as little and often, right? And I ran into this kind of being stuck and kind of scared to do it with making a quilt, right? I was so overwhelmed with what fabric goes with what design should I do, right? I mean, I have totes of fabric. I mean, if you thought my seed collection was bad, then my crafting collection was even worse. And, you know, I had totes of so much fabric, and I have my grandmother's quilt, like English paper pieced quilt, and she sent it to me before she died, and you know, it's unfinished, and one of the things that I've wanted to do is finish it for her. And I've wanted to learn how to quilt because I want to do a good job on this, right? You know, she's spent hours and hours and hours cutting out bits of paper, cutting out bits of fabric, stitching it all together, and it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I love just looking at all the vintage fabrics and things on there. So I want to do this justice because she spent so much time and love doing it, and I love my grandma so much, and you can probably tell in my voice. I miss her terribly. And you know, I had been sort of picking up these cute bits of fabric that I thought, oh, this will go with, you know, Granny's quilt, and be able to get that done. Anyway, so I have this, you know, small tote of fabric, and specifically for that project. And I've been picking up cute bits of fabric and stuff to make quilts with. And I got so overwhelmed with what fabric's going to go together and what sort of design I should do that I never started. It's just all kind of sat there, and I've been kind of scared to do anything with it until, you know, I was chatting with my dear neighbour, who said to me as I was kind of saying like, well, I don't know what fabric goes together and how do I figure this bit out. And you know, she gave me some books to kind of help, you know, the basic techniques of stuff. But the one thing that she said to me that really struck home when I said like, well, I don't know what fabric goes well together out of all the fabric that I got. And she said, does it matter? I was like, well, what do you mean? She was like, well, does it matter if it goes together? If you love the fabric, then just put it together. And then she suggested try, you know, looking at a scrappy quilt. And she was kind of explaining how she's seen quilts or, quilters who use all sorts of fabric from different holidays, different colours, different textures, like all of these things. But overall, it comes together and makes these beautiful quilts. So, you know what? Do you know what I did? I made a scrappy quilt, and I was so over the moon. Like, I'd been diligently kind of working at piecing these things together, and I even gave up, like, trying to figure out making the shapes and stuff. I went kind of very freeform on making these quilt things, and just to kind of get some success behind me, right? Like, sort of, oh, okay, I can do this. I've done this. And then I have just finished a baby quilt for my new baby niece that was born last month. And I have been kind of working on making these scrappy blocks, putting them together. But it actually gave me the confidence to, and although it's just a basic 9-patch, 9 really big squares, let's keep it simple here, folks. But, I made this quilt. Actually, I made it with my husband, and we did it together on our anniversary, and we made it for our new baby niece. So, I had this, kind of sense of encouragement of like, oh, I've been able to do that, right? And it's building on those successes, right? I will be honest. My first quilts are full of what I am going to call rustic charm, aka mistakes. But it is just getting started, right? And just that first, jump in to doing it, just getting started, and trying it, right? Trying a new skill. That was at least half the battle. It was probably most of the battle, actually, was just kind of getting out of my own head and trying it. So back to digging a garden bed, right? Because I'm assuming that we're, during this discussion in today's episode, that we're making a garden and we don't have a lot on hand, right? We've been lucky enough to, borrow a garden fork or a shovel from somebody. And, that's exactly how I did my first garden ever. Was I grabbed the garden fork out of the garage, and I dug a hole, much to my parents' annoyance, but it was in the worst possible place in the garden, because there was no way that my mum was going to let me dig a vegetable patch in the middle of the lawn. No way. So my first garden was totally in the shade. I think it had maybe like 3 hours on a good day of it getting sunshine. It was under the apple tree. It was behind the garage. It was just worst possible place. But I was determined to grow something, and I did. I managed to grow things in there, and all that I did was clear the ground of weeds and turned over that soil with a garden fork and planted some seeds. And that's really what it was. And, I'll be honest, even though I'm a much bigger girl now than what I was when I started that garden bed, oh my gosh, at least 20 years ago now. That's quite depressing now I think about it. But, I actually quite like digging. There's something kind of therapeutic for me about that. Like, I can listen to an audiobook, or, I could put my headphones in and just fire up the metal and listen to, some music through my headphones and just focus on one shovelful at a time, or one garden fork at a time, because I actually prefer to use the garden fork to dig things over. But, if you look at hand digging like an acre of soil as one thing, that's going to look like climbing a mountain or running a marathon with no training, right? If you break it down into small and manageable chunks, and that's exactly how I tackled my weedy allotment, right? I would work from one end of the garden bed to the other. And, after digging and removing weeds and stuff, I would do so many like rows or like spade or shovel widths back, right? After maybe 5 of them, I'd be like, okay, I need a bit of a break from this. So, have a nice cup of tea or whatever. But you've got all this kind of lovely soil that you've already done. Well, I would go ahead and plant that with something. After you've done a chunk, and if you're able to, plant it up if you can, because then you're able to really see, the efforts of your labours. And, the next time that I visited the allotment, I could see that the veggies were a little bit higher. And, I was able to go on pulling weeds and digging things over and just kind of doing it a little bit more. And then after I'd cleared a bit more of that garden bed, I would put some more vegetable plants and things in, right? So that worked really well for having transplants and things to go in. If I didn't, then I would put some seeds down, right? Being able to kind of see your progress, I think is very helpful in spurring you on, right? And eventually, it will all get done, right? Whether it's weeding, you're digging a garden bed, you're laying cardboard down, making compost, right? Eventually it will get done, and just keep at it little by little, right? A museum or an art gallery didn't acquire its collections overnight. I mean, I assume they didn't, acquire them overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day. It was always what, my family always said, well, Rome wasn't built in a day. But, just as, these things take time to, be built up, right? Like the museum or the art gallery, right? Having, all these beautiful paintings and things in there, right? Your garden's the same, right? You're going to be honing your skills with growing a garden, and your garden's going to change and adapt just like you. And your garden might get a little bit bigger with more beds over the seasons, right? Or it might get smaller, right? Because you're not able to manage such a bigger space. But I really want to hear from you, and let me know in the Facebook group, what are you starting with, right? Are you starting from bare ground? Are you starting from, a knee-high weedy mess, right? What's your first garden going to be like? And what are you using? Are you going to be doing a dig? Are you going to be doing a no dig? And what are you going to do in your garden or your homestead this year? Let me know. But just remember, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And definitely make use of local resources and see what your library has to offer. Like, even now, I still use my local library, and I've borrowed so many books about gardening or native plants around me, because there's a whole new set of plants out there in my backyard that I am excited to find out what they are come spring. So let me know what's going on for you in your garden and on your homestead. I love to hear from you as you are going through the garden and the growing season. I love hearing from you. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I'll see you all next week.